I buy about $21 billion worth of hardware and about $3 billion worth of indirect, which is really supporting the $24 billion business. Our supply chain is quite vast, around 10,000 people, all the way from acquisition, supply management, both direct and indirect materials to build products. We have a large logistics organization, as you can imagine. We have operations in 30 countries, over 100 locations, several thousand engineers. So I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. A lot of people might say, well, cloud computing is number 10. That seems to be pretty low on your list. Actually, I think I come from a perspective that cloud computing is already here. For anybody who's used any kind of email, from Hotmail on to Gmail today, or any kind of service, any device on their phone, they're using the cloud. So the cloud has really arrived. I don't think in business in particular, on the commercial world, that we've leveraged the cloud as much as consumers have. I think that, the question we need to ask ourselves here is, how do I get the data I need and use it for my purposes? How can I get data and use it? I think what our kids teach us, and I appreciate all the comments about the way the millennials are using data, because I have 3 myself, is the fact that they don't care where the data comes from. The data layer is irrelevant to them. They don't focus on data analytics. They don't worry about anything associated with where the data is located. It's just, how do I get that data and how do I use it? So one of the things that we're trying to do, and I think Don used the word, the age of network intelligence, and how it's a much more open world, not just an information world today, is how do we get information available to us so that we can make better decisions? The industry that was started with, like Salesforce.com was really built around software as a service. I look at software and cloud computing more as a decision as a service. How do I use computing technologies? And because we are Silicon Valley, we're exposed to a large amount of that on a daily basis. But how do I use data, and how do I use that information to make better decisions? And there's a lot of emerging solutions for global supply chain that are coming out now. I mean now, like this year, this week, last month. It's a rapidly changing landscape of which we are participating in. And most of you saw the WhatsApp announcement of the acquisition by Facebook, $16 billion for a global messaging service. Just an example of how communications and mobility is just skyrocketing in Silicon Valley. We also look for things that are low cost and reliable. Expensive implementations and large, expensive, difficult ways of doing transactions is really not in favor right now in the world that I work in. People are looking for app-driven user interfaces, so on the phone, where you can actually have an application that's been developed that gives you quick access to the data that you're trying to get to. And it's also multi-dimensional. I have a risk management app, which I'll talk about in a few seconds, which actually shows the combination of social and media and also data all combined. So we're not just looking at data anymore. We're actually looking at how do we take what Twitter is saying, what the media is saying, what data is telling us, and actually put that all together in one pot and kind of explore what that means from a risk management standpoint. So cloud computing really is what I do, something that's arrived, but now something that's really being exploited heavily by us in the commercial world. I should say the for-profit world. The number 9 is something that we're exploring heavily because we're trying to eliminate processes and people in those processes wherever we can, and that is business process convergence. Business process convergence is really where you eliminate a process or you're merging intercompany processes into one. I have a large supplier, actually several large suppliers, which I'm having discussions with about eliminating the purchase order. Why don't you just invoice me for services rendered? We'll do a post audit on to make sure that the purchase order that you're invoicing me against that you created actually is in fact valid. The reason we're doing that is because what we think is that it slows down the process when you have too many transactions in it, so you want to eliminate the transactions. When you eliminate the transactions, you eliminate the people, you eliminate that cost, but at the same time, you're also creating a new way of doing business, new way of looking at how you do business. And we can do that with our strategic suppliers that we have a long-term relationship with. Just parenthetically, I think it was mentioned earlier, I was the Chief Procurement Officer of LG, probably one of the larger electronics companies in the world now. Since the Japanese have kind of faded between Samsung and LG in Korea, I think pretty much all the televisions in the world and probably a good amount of the Android phones, all the appliances that are pretty popular in the United States, and computers and networking gear in other parts of the world. They really represent kind of a powerhouse. But what was fascinating to me was two things. One is when I was faced with the recession of 2008, 2009 that really hit the world quite hard, LG decided not to lay off any employees and instead to double down and to send some of those employees to our suppliers and help them out. We provided low-interest loans to our suppliers, or no-interest loans to many of our suppliers, to make sure that they remained vested in LG. And at the same time, we told them that we expect them to invest in LG in the future when we come to economic recovery. This kind of collaboration, I think, that happens in Asia between Asian suppliers and their OEMs is quite remarkable. And somebody asked me, what is the biggest difference? I said the biggest difference when I got to Korea and living in Seoul and working for the CEO of LG Electronics was usually you're talking about contracts and acquisition process around contracts. I asked my team to give me a report on all the contracts that LG had in place, and they came back with 3. There were no contracts. Most of the $50 billion that LG was spending in Asia with Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Taiwanese companies had no contracts. They were all based on very strong collaborative historical relationships that was really very different than anything I exposed to before. And of course, the contracts were with U.S. companies, as you might imagine, because the U.S. companies just demanded that they have contracts for their services, even though they were probably less favorable than others than a non-formal or informal contract. Extended supply chains, I think, are also becoming less extended. We used to be kind of look at the world as a big global marketplace where you'd be dangling at the end of a food chain somewhere, but now the global integration of logistics is pretty much complete. I can move anything anywhere at great speed. It's just a question of cost, whether I want to move it to Brazil or China. Material inbound or outbound has become much less difficult. And our customers are now, and many organizations are talking about these control towers or multi-tier control towers where they actually look at the critical parts of the business and the outsourced and non-critical. A good example of that is, if you look at your phone, in your phone there's probably 2 or 3 devices that actually drive the performance of that phone. One is obviously network drivers and things that are processors that are very key, very expensive components of the phone. The rest of it, really the general components, printed circuit boards, fabricated plastics, mechanical assemblies and things like that, cables and connectors, pretty low technology. That's pretty much all outsourced and is provided by other companies in the supply chain around the world. So really it's kind of this 80-20 rule now where most companies are actually operating their critical components and then outsourcing the rest. And they do this by actually having control towers where they actually look multiple tiers down their supply chain to not only understand what's happening at one layer, but it's happening 2 or 3 layers down that. Number 8 for me is the equalization of global labor costs. There was a time just a few years ago when China was the lowest labor cost market in the world. 10 years ago, everybody was rushing to China. Most of our customer conversations were around how do they get quickly to China to do their manufacturing. But now it's kind of equalized a little bit more. We have a fairly large footprint in the United States. Made in the USA is real. There are some stresses and strains around it, but we do have a lot of opportunity. We have large facilities in the Carolinas, in Texas, and California, where we actually are kind of receiving and having a lot of conversations with companies around where they can manufacture closer to the point of consumption. And at the same time, although on this chart you'll notice that India and Ukraine, Ukraine actually is one of the lowest labor markets in the world. And actually we have a facility in Ukraine and India where actually we're doing a lot of production where before some of that might have automatically gone to places like China. Thomas Friedman said in his book, The World is Flat, 10 years ago that, that basically the world had fundamentally changed. And when he said it, it actually hadn't really changed all the way yet, but it's kind of ironic that I think now, 10 years later, it actually has. I think we're seeing a lot of disruptions. Labor costs are rising 15 to 20% in China, and that's creating a sense that Mexico is now getting near the point where it can be very competitive with China. Labor arbitrage is less of an issue when we source. It used to be that labor was a very high content, a lot of electronics and electromechanical devices, and now it's actually shrunk to, in some cases, as low as 10 or 5% of the total cost. And companies are more interested now in remote staffing. I have a percentage of almost every department located in a low-cost area of the world to augment the higher cost that I have for that staff in a higher cost area of the world. We have a lot of efforts underway to actually look at different parts of the United States where you have different labor costs versus others. The states now, you must experience this as well, but the states are competing very heavily for work, very aggressively for work. Governors are knocking on our doors. I'm sure they are knocking on your doors to actually get more of the business there. So we actually, even in the United States, we have the equalization of labor costs. Number 7, on slide number 7, is raw material scarcity. I think this is a trend we have to keep our eye on. We kind of forget about it when we saw, copper, gold, and some other metals stabilizing. But I feel, and most of the long-term forecasts that I look at suggest that the emerging country consumption of raw materials, specifically China, is enormous, and it's going to put more pressure on innovations in materials. When I was at LG, for example, we moved from copper coils in air conditioners to aluminum coils. Big change in the amount of cost, but also in the amount of material used in air conditioners. Because of Frank Dodd, most of you are probably engaged with this as well, but complex minerals is a big issue, making sure that when we do acquire materials, they're coming from the right sources in the right places. And the whole idea of transparency in supply chains is probably the single largest mega trend that I see. This concept, going back to Don's point of network intelligence and openness, I think for us it means a much more transparent business model. And that transparency is just at one level down. We have to look at multiple levels in our acquisition process to actually see what's happening. Really a kind of a concept of trusting and verifying throughout it. Number 6, skill specialization. So those of you all who work with some of the universities, over the last decade, I would say there's been a huge jump in the amount of schools that are providing courses in procurement and in supply chain. I speak at many of them, recruit from many of them, and we're seeing much more specialization in this area of procurement and supply chain. There are new programs in cloud-based supply chain, cost innovation, the old value analysis arguments, looking at total landed cost, logistics, and even courses on emerging countries. When I talk to various schools, what I'm seeing is that our need is becoming more of one to actually hire people for specific skills in specific areas. For example, all the technology changes around, app-driven technologies. It's becoming increasingly important for all of us to actually have people on board who can actually help understand, deploy, fix, utilize these technologies. And I think the schools are going to be important in doing that. So this whole area of supply chain acquisition skills specialization is important. Another trend that I see kind of expanding, I touched on this already, but it's the whole idea of virtual integration. The whole idea of actually looking at our acquisition process as one where we don't have to do everything, but we have to be kind of a control tower for everything that's done. And what that means is we have to kind of sit back and kind of look at it from what views do we need to have, what kinds of technologies do we need to give us those views, and then what kind of skills do we have in place to actually do that work. I'm working heavily with my team on developing logistics and tracking capabilities around transportation, looking at how how fast I can go, how much risk I can take, by how fast I go, and looking at the trade-offs between velocity and risk and cost. And really developing a whole concept around the command and control over what's happening in my business rather than distributing that out. If you look back 10 years ago, it was all about delegation and pushing decision-making to the lowest point in the organization. I think we're seeing some repercussions from that. I think it's more important that we have very effective command and control over how it's done, the decisions that are made around it, by highlighting any decision over a certain level actually has to move to the command center and actually to be for that decision to be made. Number 4, the growth of regional and local sourcing. I touched on this when I talked about the states and the U.S. We're seeing a kind of a renaissance in manufacturing in the United States, but we're also seeing a significant push in Eastern Europe as well as in Asia. Indonesia and India are both rapidly expanding and competing with China in the future. And the whole idea of corporate social environmental responsibility, or CSER, is becoming more normal. The reason that we wouldn't source, for example, in China or Vietnam or some other country was because that we didn't feel that they had the right corporate social environmental responsibility in place. That's rapidly becoming kind of an assumption for doing business with any Western corporation. So if you don't have that, you don't play. And we're seeing a big change there in a lot of companies now. It's the new normal of being competitive globally. Number 3, I want to dive into this a little bit because one of my big emphasis is about making supply chains predictable versus unpredictable. We talked about the automobile analogy earlier and how it's very difficult to drive fast and safe at the same time. And I think we're seeing that in supply chains. We're trying to get to the point where they're predictable. The headlights on the automobile actually turning around the corner so you see the deer a split second before it hits your windshield. I think the whole idea of getting predictable analytics in our business is becoming increasingly important. Therefore, I've made the argument that supply chains are becoming multidimensional. And the whole idea of a 3D supply chain is upon us, and it's something that is transformational as far as how we look at our work, and it's something I kind of want to dig into a little deeper for the next couple of minutes. If you go to the next slide. The focus of what we're trying to accomplish here is how do we speed up our product launches, how do we enter new markets at the same time we're mitigating risk. This is the gas pedal and the brake pedal example I used with the automobile of fast and safe. And in order to do that, we have to have a much broader view of our entire supply chain. But if you put up slide number 14, it should have like a real complicated big circle on it. It's a 3D supply chain. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm. We're getting there.
Okay. So if you look at it, just pretend you're holding a ball in your hand, and this is a ball and not a circle. And along the equator of that ball is your supply chain, your velocity. This is where, from a concept or design phase all the way through its development, its manufacturing, its shipping, selling, repairing, all the way time to market is measured, or how you get something out the door. This is all about speed and all about how do you actually get something done as efficiently, effectively as possible. The vertical axis is all about risk. And the vertical axis is one that actually looks at the below the line, or the below the equator, lower hemisphere, if you will, of the ball in your hand. And actually that lower hemisphere is really all about risk production, or from raw material and the mine that makes it all the way up through its device level, or if you're dealing with cotton, it could be organic cotton, for example. The integration layer is when something is put together or assembled or manufactured or put into its form. And then the product, when does it actually become a product? When does it have a logo or a name on it? When is it done? All of these things represent the risk supply chain below the equator. So basically any risks in our business come at us from below, they come from us from the side. They could be a supply impact, they could be a quality impact. They usually come in the area of logistics or cost or other examples of issues that we have in our supply chain, but basically they come from below. The above the line, or the northern hemisphere of that supply chain, really is the consumers of risk. There are people that consume risk. It might be somebody who gets your product and it doesn't work. It could be somebody who has to insure that product against something happened to it. Or it could be a creditor, or it could be somebody who's actually providing some kind of business intelligence around what's happening in that supply chain. So here you have people like all the banks and investors and markets, and people that are actually receiving the risk of whatever you're producing. And I'm sure in a government sense would be a broader government, or even the people would actually be absorbing some risk for problems that would occur in the supply chain below. So the whole idea here is to, how do you take that entire model and actually go faster, as well as while you're de-risking the supply chain. So de-risking it, and pretend this is a ball again. If you make that ball smaller, it means that it's going faster at a lower risk. If it's obviously oblong on the vertical axis, it would have high risk and high velocity. If it was oblong on the horizontal axis, it would be low velocity and low risk. And the whole idea here is you want to shrink this dimension so that the entire ecosystem of your supply chain is actually performing better at a total lower cost. So the entire size of this sphere actually represents total cost. And I think in the future, we're going to take more and more into consideration about this. I've had conversations with insurance companies who are very interested in this. Conversations with investment funds, investors who are very interested in this. And then you can talk to somebody at mine in Australia, and they're very interested in this. So the whole idea is this ecosystem kind of concept around procurement is going to be part of our future. But what does that mean? How can you actually turn that into something that you can use? What if you could actually make it into something you could hold in your hand? So if you go to slide number 14, we actually launched, it's our own, we spun out this company, it's independent now, that actually we've been developing apps for that we can actually put on our phone. I've actually got them on my phone, where I can actually look at, for example, in slide number 14, how do I monitor the transportation of my goods around the world through my phone? This is kind of real-time visibility to what's happening in my shipments around the world. Slide number 15 is really a view of the units that are moving along that horizontal axis that I talked about, the equator. What is the lead time for my components? How many units am I producing in my manufacturing line? What I want is I can spin a dial and I can actually have a live view of what's happening in my supply chain by some mobile device I'm holding in my hand. And this is important because what I want to do is use this as a decision-making tool. Up front I mentioned decision as a service versus software as a service. And I don't really care what the data says or where it's located. I just want access to it. So what we're doing is we create, for those of you with maybe a little IT background, I think we create APIs, which are adapters or connectors, that connect to multiple different types of data systems that actually extract or export that data to me so I can make better decisions. So the whole idea is where data is actually working for you rather than you're working for the data. And how many of us have felt in our careers, I know I have, where I'm often working for the information rather than the information is working for me. So one of the things that's really exciting about mobile applications is that dimension, where you can actually put your high beams on in that car, and you can actually look deeper into your supply chain or look deeper into your process and actually extract that information out to work for you. One of my favorites is on slide 16, which is the exposure application, which is, it says, verified, mitigated, and assigned. This is actually when I have a risk event, and I monitor on a daily basis all extreme events that happen in the world. So if there's for example, the situation in Ukraine would pop up automatically from Twitter feeds and media events and come to my phone with a calculation of exactly what sites in Flextronics are impacted, what suppliers are in that zone, what customers are going to be implicated downstream for an impact in that supply chain. The same thing happens for environmental events, earthquakes, storms. I have that going on for any kind of disruption that would occur in transportation around the world. It's a global monitoring system where really it's like a security system for your house, only I have it for my supply chain. I actually monitor global supply and all of that's pushed to my phone, and it beeps when there's an extreme risk event that has customer impact to me, and I know about it pretty much instantaneously through holding the phone in my hand. This is kind of the trend that I think we're going to see more of as time goes by, because this ability to extract data and make it useful for us is going to be enormously important. Number two, you touched on it earlier, but it deserves its own number, and that is corporate social and environmental responsibility is a fundamental now. It's no longer optional. There's no option to do it or not do it. For those of who've had a career for a long period of time, you know that for some they didn't feel that they had to do it, and now it's become pretty much a policy penetration issue where now it's trickled all the way down the supply chain in most countries. Emerging country laws are catching up with to some extent, but the corporations that are operating in the countries that don't have laws actually are operating at a higher level than actually the laws are requiring them to. So I think this is going to be enormously important. And then the final one, and this is going to, I think, take a few minutes to talk about, because my number one is actually not everybody's number one, but I think after listening to Don, I think he could kind of resonate with this, because Ronald Costa and to a certain extent other thinkers around how the world is collaborating differently will understand the fact that the zero sum is like gambling or a sporting event. Zero sum is win-lose. Gambling is win-lose. Non-zero is something that was articulated by an author by the name of Robert Wright in a book called Non-Zero. It was written in 2001. And what he really argues is how mankind, if you go back all the way to the Eskimos, and he went way back, has actually been on a steady progressional climb towards a non-zero approach. And it was very fascinating to listen to just before I was talking about all the changes that are occurring with social media. Somebody mentioned about how they don't use email, they're texting with their girlfriends, all these things. I think what we're seeing is something we need to really think about from a procurement standpoint. And what Robert Wright talked about was an Eskimo, the Eskimos actually were forced into non-zero levels of collaboration when one village would get a whale, 1 year, and another village would have no whale. And, when the villagers started to die, they could either attack the other village and try to take their whale, or they could make a deal. They could say, look, we get a whale 1 year, we'll split the whale with you. You get a whale 1 year, you split the whale with us. And it all became part of the division of labor where, once they figured out how to build boats and throw spears and kill whales, now they were moving on towards where they could actually collaborate and share the harvest of the whale meat. And then there's examples all the way up through time, all the way up through, there's wars and disruptions and terrorism events and things that happen along the way. But if you look at it in a progressive line, kind of you correlate all the events of what's happened, really, it basically goes back to the fact that, the bees are right. You have to work together in order to build a hive and make honey. So, it's the whole idea of how do you actually look at this. And then, of course, in my experience, I talked about Korea, where we had no contracts. And I balanced that against a really illegal environment in the United States where everything's a contract. I think we have contracts for contracts. We have so many ways of having to go about doing our business that I think it's causing some real dissonance in me as far as how we should do our jobs better. When outside the United States we can do it one way, inside the United States we can do it another. But this whole concept of non-zero and the whole idea of an app-driven world and mobile devices. I constantly tell my team, they come to me and they say, well, we got to change a procedure or we got to change a process. I said, no, you don't. I said, you don't have to change a process. You don't have to change a procedure. You just lay it on top of it. The way you win a war or a battle is you take the high ground. I said, just keep moving higher and just build on top of what you already have. Don't try to change it fundamentally because you'll never get it done. And again, our business is such that, in a for-profit, market-driven company, 1 quarter, if I have a bad quarter or maybe bad 2 quarters, I'm gone. And so you constantly have to build and move things in different ways. And what that means, I think, from a non-zero standpoint is, moving from relational to integrated. I think we're looking at systems, processes, and tools which are more overlapping and connected. By the very virtue of the fact that I can build a transport app in 2 weeks, and I can slap it on my phone, and all that thing does is extract data from different sources. Some of those sources might be a warehouse where somebody's got a barcode. Some of those sources might be a supplier, which actually has entered information into a system. And things are becoming much more integrated. I think we're moving away from category management. Again, sometimes I fight against some of our own textbooks on the subject of purchasing, but I think we're moving towards multi-tier supplier management away from just category management. For example, IT might be called a category, PCs might be called a commodity, but multi-tier supplier management would be much more interested, mainly not so much in the software I might buy in a certain commodity, but actually what software I buy, how I buy that software. Should it be an app-based mobile software? Should it be an enterprise software? I mean, decision-making at a control tower is asking the question why, asking the question how, asking the question when, and asking the question how much, and doing the questions at the control tower level rather than at a category level in order to make sure that the most important decisions are made properly. And then really driving trust, transparency, and reliability. And this whole idea of trust and transparency is enormous. I mean, the openness right now of communications that occur, not just from email traffic, from texting between suppliers and companies, is just taken on enormous proportions. There are chat rooms we have with suppliers, and we just basically, that's gotten everybody a lot more honest. The more transparent it is, the more open it is, actually the more honest it is. We're finding that we're having less problems as things become more open. I'm on the Corporate and Compliance Investigations Committee, and I see a lot of issues that are occurring, but once people realize that it's open, it's very difficult for people to hide and do wrong things. So I think there's a goodness around this whole idea of non-zero. And then, healthy wins all the time. One of the ecosystems that I'm always reminded of is when the settlers in the United States moved west, and they just about killed every buffalo in sight. And pretty soon, the plains started to experience a lot of disruptions, right? There's an eruption of prairie dogs, there was an eruption of different kinds of insects that, were in the food chain for the buffaloes. And so I think this whole idea of ecosystems in procurement is important for us to keep our eye on. And I think there are different ecosystems in the world. Another book I find fascinating is a book called The Geography of Thought by Richard Nesbitt. Nesbitt, well-known psychologist for probably the last 20 years. He wrote a book in 2004 called The Geology of Thought. Really worth the read if you get a chance, along with non-zero. But he really talked about how really different cultures think differently, and why they think that way. And going back, so why did Korea and Japan and China, why do they think one way? Why do we in the West think another way? I think if you get underneath really why we think the way we do, we ought to understand that and leverage it to our competitive advantage. I mean, as an American company, I think understanding these things is important because we can use that and leverage that for our benefit. My conclusions are this. One is, it's an app-driven economy. It's an app-driven economy, and it's increasingly that way. If you have any kind of device, phone, even if you don't, if your wife, girlfriend, son, daughter does, or we're living in an app-driven world. So we have to get our function, and we have to get our business on an app-driven solution. And I think that's cloud-based, and I think that's process efficient, and I think that's low cost. It does all the things that we should do along the way. I think that the people we're hiring today, number two, I think the people we're hiring today, the millennials, are transparent. And I think we have to start to recognize that a lot of the processes and policies and procedures that we built over the years we have to make them more transparent, or we have to use them in different ways to keep that transparency there, because transparency gives us speed, it gives us integrity, it gives us reliability, and I think it makes for a better business. I think we're healthier overall. CSDR is a great example of how transparency and honesty actually is helping the world become a better place. And then finally, and it's really all about collaboration. My definition of collaboration is simultaneous communication. So what kind of tools do we have that actually give us simultaneous communication? How do we actually do things more often that don't waste time because it's a handoff? Somebody's actually providing us a communication or pushing in emails to us or forwarding things to us, really, rather than looking at one version of the truth. How do we make decisions faster? This goes back to what I said about control towers. How do we actually make decisions better because we're making them faster? And the way you do that is collaborate. Collaboration being one version of the truth or simultaneous communication.